You're listening to Catholic Family Podcast.
All right, we're back for part 2 of the series with Father Borja and my dad. We're talking about the decline of culture, the decline of civilization in many ways. We started in part 1 talking about the height of civilization, at least in the Middle Ages, and now we're going to discuss kind of some of the events that have seen or shown the decline. What happened to the world? Why are we where we are? What made us the people that we are compared to the Middle Ages, where people lived for God and built magnificent churches to God, and now we build Burger Kings and sit on our couches and whatnot. So in this episode, again, part 2, we're going to talk about Luther up into the 1960s. There's a lot to cover. There's a lot that happened in that time. Father, thank you again for joining.
Yes, thank you for having me, Kevin.
And Dad, thank you again.
Kevin.
And so I guess the best place to start is Luther. And I shamelessly plugged many of my podcasts and future podcasts in the last show. And I'll do so now because Ina and I, my wife and I, had a nice show about Martin Luther that's really fascinating, a really incredible documentary about Martin Luther and the Protestant Revolution, not the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant Revolution. It's an important difference. Fantastic documentary made by a group of conservative Polish Catholics, which I cannot recommend enough. You have to pay $5 to watch it. It's on Vimeo. I can attach a link to this show. Can't recommend it enough. You will see very clearly the issues with Luther as a person, Lutheranism as a religion, and the issues with the world at the time. How did it happen? What made Luther successful? And I don't know if either of you two know much about this. And I'll give a pause if you have any comment. If not, I'll go on because I've got Luther in the bag.
Now, why don't you go ahead? I've always been curious as to what basically the underlying condition was at that point, because obviously Luther didn't just do what he did and nail his 95 Theses and boom, that kicked out. Obviously, the devil had to be tilling the soil for a time before that.
Exactly. And as we mentioned in part 1, a part of the issue was Rome, the Vatican, the church was a bit of a mess. They had a big issue going on where they knocked down the old St. Peter's Cathedral, which had been standing for, I believe, 1,200 years. And to build a new one. Now, these were the Medici popes. There were a couple in a row that were not moral men. They were valid, but not moral. They were humanist. They were much more modern, especially for the time. And the selling of indulgences was what Luther supposedly, that was his supposed issue. And it happened, but it wasn't really that widespread of a problem that some people, some bad priests and some bad monks, whatever, were selling indulgences. So they're saying you'll have your sins forgiven if you give us money to help pay for St. Peter's in Rome. Now, this was one of the basic issues. You see, again, Rome was a bit of a mess, and the culture was in decline. I think it had reached its peak, perhaps 1300s, who knows? I mean, somewhere around there. And you could tell it going back down and a lot more immorality peaking in, a lot more greed. The kings were getting more powerful and wanting more and more and more. It had been years since the last crusade, and they were fighting with each other and bickering and just wanting to have more rather than to dedicate their lives to God. Now, obviously, there were exceptions, but not many. And so when Luther came around, and again, you got to watch this documentary. It's fantastic. I'll make a very long story short. He kind of came in. He printed his theses, and it was a perfect storm. It happened at the perfect time, right when the printing press had just been invented. It was totally new that people could distribute pamphlets and flyers by the thousands rather than by handwritten one by one. So it was really, everything was very new in terms of media, which is, again, kind of an ironic comparison to today's time. And so what you saw was you had a church in Rome, which was in a mess. You had the kings and princes who desperately just wanted to get richer and have more. And you had, I guess, a people that was it's an interesting question with the actual people of the time. I don't really know what happened to the people. Like with, say, 1940s Germany, it's hard to tell what exactly happened to the actual normal people. Why did they go along? That's a little bit tougher to say. But anyway, long story short, Luther was able, with the printing press and with the help of many of these princes who wanted power, to overthrow the Catholic Church, because the princes and the kings, in return for supporting Luther and saying, hey, Lutheranism is our state religion, they got everything from the church. They got all of the land, they got all the monasteries, they got all of the gold, everything that the church owned, which was a lot in this time in the 1500s. And all of these kings and princes, especially in Germany and in the German areas, they got all of that from becoming supporters of Luther, who said, hey, kick out the Pope. We don't need any of these guys. We want to be ruled by the state, pretty much. And so really, our times, Luther, that whole issue, the Lutheran Revolution, really kick-started our quote-unquote modern times. And I think we see a lot of that now today with the rule of the secular state. We see the issues with, obviously the Christians, the Lutheran Christians, who actually don't have any actually Christ-like beliefs. They're very often pro-abortion. They don't have the same values we do as Catholics, even though we're all lumped together as Christians. And so I think that Luther, that's why we started at Luther. This is the start of the decline of civilization.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things we talked about in the first show, that authority prior to Luther was very clearly from God to the Pope to the bishops to the clergy to the laity, and basically Luther completely reordered that, and so authority under Luther was basically man to God with the Bible as an intermediary. And of course, I'm the ultimate authority in terms of my interpretation of God. And of course, it backfired even in Luther's time, because he would complain that he would give sermons and he would have people in his congregations, in his words, laughing in their sleeve because they didn't agree with them, because he had basically undermined the God-given authority that we had with the church and replaced it with a man-centric authority.
Right, and so in many ways, it kind of became anarchy, and you had this really a mess. And really, one of the most fascinating things, I think, is what happened in Middle Europe was you saw when the churches all got booted out and all the monks and the sisters were killed or sent to the streets and the monasteries were burnt. There were the buildings that were made, and they said even the fireplaces, some of the engineering, the technology even of the time in the 1500s was never seen again until 200 years later. So they literally, the civilization was kicked back 200 years because they kicked the Catholic Church out of their countries, which I think is absolutely incredible. And you see, again, the effect that the Catholic Church has on society. I think Dad had a really good comment, I think, in our WhatsApp conversation, where he said, I forget exactly what you said, but kind of how the Catholic, I got to find what you said because it's a really good quote. Yeah, where he said the false dichotomy of faith or science or religion or progress. So you're saying pretty much, as we see it now, it's like, well, we progressed outside of the church rather than the church was progress. The church was the earthly progress, and it was for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I mean, here's just one quick case study is, modern education teaches us that Christopher Columbus was hounded by the church not to travel the way he did, because they said the church was the earth was flat. The reality was everybody in the world at that point in the Western world knew that the earth was round, and it actually turned out that Christopher Columbus went the wrong direction, because he had misunderstood or miscalculated the size of the earth and actually thought it was smaller than it was, and it was the church who had properly calculated the size of the earth, and had warned him not to, I think it was not to go west. So, I mean, it's one of those urban legends that builds up, and we're taught that, the church was anti-science or was backwards or whatever. But the reality was that the church really did get it.
And you see this there's so many Catholics and priests and laity alike that have contributed greatly towards advances in science. One thing that I like to show the students is that just from my Catholic faith, there's just a long list of very famous people, inventors, scientists, etc., that were Catholic, were strong in their Catholic faith, and helped find these advancements in science and in other areas.
Well, and there's so many ways to see that people have been lied to. I remember, I think I even read somewhere on the internet somewhere that the entire written history of, I don't know what time, of the Middle Ages or a certain time only exists because of the Catholic monks. No one else. There was a certain region, I don't remember where or when, but there was a certain time when if you did not have these monks keeping records and writing things down, we wouldn't know what happened. So really, technology, history, all these things, the true history was actually happening, were kept by the church. Your town logs and all these things. Christian, again, who I'm going to have on a podcast to talk about monarchy in a feudal age in Munich in the 1400s. He was also saying a similar thing. All right, yeah, I honestly don't remember where I was going with that, guys. So apologies for that interruption. My brain just goes sometimes too fast onto another subject, and so what I was actually talking about before or at the time is just kind of gone off into space somewhere. But yeah, again, I guess we'll move a bit forward, because I mean, part of the entire Luther issue was the Enlightenment, the whole idea that. Well, can either of you? What would be your definition of the Enlightenment, or should I give it a stab? Anybody?
Well, for me, when I think of the quote-unquote Enlightenment in the modern usage, they're usually referring it to the time period of the French Revolution, which was contrary to Enlightenment.
I think of it as a time where mankind looked to himself for answers rather than looking to God for answers. And of course, it's a darkness, but we call it enlightenment because it's what's taken root.
Right, and I think that it's technically said about the French Revolution times, but I think in my opinion, it started with Luther, and it started with this time where you saw the kings and queens around Europe taking the power for themselves. Look at England, look at Henry VIII, who wasn't technically Lutheran, but he set up his own church and all these different things where, as Dad said, they were setting themselves above God. I mean, humanists, they're saying, hey, we can find the answers ourselves. We don't need anything. We don't need inspiration. We don't need God. We don't need the church.
Man is capable of himself.
Exactly. And I think that started way back with Luther, who really promulgated many of these issues. And it brought us to the French Revolution. I think that we're skipping several hundreds of years, but in those years, I think a lot of what you saw was you did see fights between Catholics and Protestants. You had hundreds of years of fights between both in Europe. Many, I'm sure millions of people died because of it. You saw many churches burnt, unfortunately, and in the French Revolution and the time afterwards obviously only felt the effects of that more here in Europe. And I think that, I guess around that time, we can start talking a little bit about America. So maybe America, the founding of America and what America is, was that a bit of a hindrance for the slow decline of society, or did society around the world continue as it was going with America or not?
Well, I would say just when you think about the amount of people that converted to the Catholic faith in the New World, I can't remember the exact number, but it was something to the effect that it made up for the people that had left the faith through means of the schisms that took place with Luther and Henry VIII, etc. But he had this this intense faith, so to say, simple but intense faith in the people that in the New World, especially. I think of Our Lady of Guadalupe down in Mexico, and how many of the Mexican people converted to the Catholic faith, and like I said, were very fervent, very devout. So you see this, this terrible tragedy happen in Europe, but then on the other side of the world, the faith being brought to these people, and just that fervent, devout faith that especially was had, I think would have helped to stem some of that decline. That it would have in my mind, would have happened much quicker than not, were it not have been for this.
Yeah, and I think I say all the time on these shows that I think there is a true spiritual battle between good and bad, between the devil and God, and all of these different things. I think it really exists in our prayers, and they really truly fight a battle, and the sufferings of others and God's grace, of course, is really almost physical. And that's how I picture it. I mean, this is just my opinion, and I think that a lot of that today we suffer because we don't have enough people praying and suffering, and we don't have penitence. We don't have whole monasteries where all they do is pray. They pray and work all day long. And I think that if there's a reason, which we'll talk about in part 3 more, why we so quickly decline now, it's because of that. And as you say, Father, as they have these issues in Europe at the time, the Americas were flourishing, and maybe that balance, that fight, the graces coming from the Americas helped a little bit to slow it down, which I guess again kind of accelerated a little bit during the French Revolution, which brought even more of the, I suppose, communistic ideas, right? The ideas of what is equality, fraternity, and liberty, right?
So Masonic ideals.
Exactly, right. And I think obviously the Masonic, the Freemasons that we know today really pretty much started at that time. I guess technically they started in Germany, I think in the 1770 or so, but I think in France at that time, that's really where they really promulgated. And then in the US, unfortunately, they came over and some of them also helped to write some of our major documents and whatnot. But I guess that's an interesting question. I mean, was that the beginnings of democracy, true quote unquote democracy in America and in France, since they were founded by many of these people, many of them were true enemies of God and of Christ, that had to have drastically affected, again, the decline of society, right?
Yeah, I think that the church has come out and not expressed a specific preference for monarchy or popular forms of government. I think either one can be sanctifying, either one can be edifying. But I do think that democracy it kind of continued on the trajectory that Luther had started by putting man at the center of things. So rather than having a social structure that was kind of a reflection of the ideal church structure that was top down, or a monarchy is top down, now you had more of a Protestant type of structure that was basically giving power to the people. And I think that our fallen human nature is such that you give the common man that kind of authority, that kind of power, and he's not going to typically, over the course of time, wield it properly. And I think we did. I mean, we're a great country for a time, but as it's gone, we've basically just allowed degeneracy, and we've allowed taxation. We've allowed the shifting of wealth, and all these different things have slowly crept in because we've put it all to a vote.
Yeah, and as you say, just because there are more people doesn't mean it's a better solution, right?
And the whole aspect of, just like you're mentioning, that you take the authority is skewed, and you especially you see the separation of church and state, and that's obviously not the way that it should be. And the church should obviously have a say, and how it used to be. But that's one of the things that with the founding of our country, you do have those influences that have crept in, Freemasonic influences and Protestant influences, etc., that have made it very difficult at times to be able to have that right focus of how it's supposed to be.
Right, and that's such a good point between the separation of church and state. And I have a question about that I've never really understood. In a democracy, because obviously in like a Catholic monarchy, you have much more of a direct union, I suppose, between church and state in morality or immorality. But with a democracy, is it any different? If we had a Catholic democracy, what would the church's role be in that? Would the church, would they literally have a veto? Would they have a say in who is elected, or are they just more of a over the top moral guide in terms of church being united with state?
Yeah, I like to think that it's that last one, Kevin. Where I always love the imagery of a president or a prime minister or whoever it is being sworn into office and having churchmen on either side behind them, standing above them. And I think that it's great. It's great symbolism. I'm a big believer that separation of church and state just basically means that you don't want your religious leaders, you don't want churchmen holding positions of political power. It's like giving Gandalf the ring, right? It's too much power. And but your secular powers and your church powers should be subservient to each other. And I think that's the ideal relationship, is that they both work for the betterment of the other and work together.
Right. So it's not a literal union almost. It is a union in terms of a symbiotic almost. You're part of the same goal, trying to go. And I guess I'm sure we see in Poland, for example, we see a union of church and state. Okay, it's the Novus Ordo Church, unfortunately, but I know that the president is extremely Catholic or modern Catholic, and that I know that they take it very seriously what they do, and I think they have many of their stately functions are done, at least afterwards they go and celebrate the modern mass. But it's something. I mean, that's something. Boy, that's kind of the dream, right? I guess that's where we're going to go. I guess at the end of part 3, where we say, okay, so what's the ultimate goal here? Where do we want to be, and what can we do to try to help boost our society and our culture out of the dregs, out of the garbage can where it is right now? And so I guess moving on a little bit past the French Revolution, the founding of the Americas, I guess a couple of the other issues before the Vatican Council that I wrote down were, I wrote down Napoleon, the Age of Decadence. I haven't studied these things in detail, but if you read, say, Tolstoy or even Jane Austen, you can tell very well that the Age of Decadence, that's what I call it. That's a time after Napoleon where there weren't many wars and people really were extremely frivolous. At least when you read the novels, they seem extremely frivolous. They had very little cares for serious issues, and they cared very much for what they ate and what they drank and how they looked. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Shortly following that, at least in my timeline, you guys can correct me if I'm missing something or if I'm wrong. Following the Age of Decadence was in the 1830s or 40s. Remember, during this time, Our Lady had several apparitions, major apparitions. That's a really important thing to remember, too, that shortly between the Age of Decadence and the Industrial Revolution, or maybe at the time of the Industrial Revolution, Our Lady appeared in La Salette, and then, of course, she appeared at Lourdes. La Salette, Father, do you know the dates? I think La Salette was in the 1840s. Did you either of you know that? I could Google it, obviously.
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah, I don't either. In the middle of the 19th century, and then Lourdes was, I think, honestly, only shortly after. Maybe, yeah, so maybe 10, 20, 30 years later from La Salette. And so Our Lady is appearing and really, especially at La Salette, is giving a very dire message and saying the world needs to change its ways or it's there's going to be big issues. There's going to be war, there's going to be strife, there's going to be death, and souls are going to go to hell. And I think if you go and study these times, you see very clearly why. I mean, you're going literally from the age of decadence into an age where modern man wakes up to the idea, or they invent things to make things bigger, faster, better. And I think that, in my opinion, of all the times in history, okay, it's from the Middle Ages at least, you had the biggest events were Luther, the Industrial Revolution, and Vatican II. I don't know what you guys think about that.
No, I heard a very interesting discussion, and I don't know. I think it's germane here that the age of science, basically what it did, and this is a Jordan Peterson thing. It kind of rewired our brain to a degree where, instead of historically from the beginning of man, we were all about story. Okay, we were about morality. That basically, if you look at the Old Testament, it was passed down as a set of stories, and that's kind of how we interacted with the world. Beginning with the scientific revolution and then into the Industrial Revolution, basically we reoriented things so that our interaction with the world was through things, through products or what we ate, whatever it was, and so I think that kind of helped to set us into a mode where we were no longer as concerned about morality and what's going to happen to us after death and all that, to the more materialistic, where we count our lives based on what we own, where we live, what we eat, all these things. And I think the Industrial Revolution was what really kicked that into high gear, Kevin. I think that's where you're going with it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And I think, and when you look at the leaders around the world too at the time, I think you really start to see, and I guess it's just through all time, most leaders are bad. And it seems like most of them, just the ones you hear about and read about, because the good ones you just don't read about, right? The good leaders, they're not in the history books because there's nothing to write about. So they're usually the best ones. But the ones you read about, they all had they seemed like they all were greedy and just wanted more. But boy, it seems like during this time, it really starts to ramp up, and you start to see real icky immorality and really abuse of the lower class people, and you see people working 80-hour work weeks, and they never go home, and you have the sweatshops and all these things start. You have a lot of children running around on the streets. I mean, St. John Bosco was around in this time where that was like his entire mission, was to save these little boys who are running around, mugging people to stay alive. And another incredible saint, of course. And that was his mission, was to save these kids who were left on the street because one reason or another they were orphaned. And it's just another example of the horrible issues of that time. And that was following the Industrial Revolution, was, of course, pretty shortly after was the Communist Revolution. And I guess a show for another time would be the entire election of Pope St. Pius X, which I think is one of the most incredible historical moments in the last hundreds of years for sure, and how he really saved a very steep decline. I don't know if either of you have a comment on that. I think that's really fascinating, how I think it seemed like Vatican II was planned even for 60 years earlier, and thanks be to God, Pope St. Pius X was elected instead and saved the world.
Well, and we see, I mean, he warned us about modernism, about these people who are trying to infiltrate the church, and we see the effects of that in our day and age. We see the modernists in positions of quote unquote authority that are trying to destroy the church. But Pope St. Pius X warned us about that way back when. And, he instituted, for example, his encyclical Pascendi, the oath against modernism, and he did all these things to try to combat the modernism, the synthesis of all heresy, so to say. But just the whole aspect of how he got elected, and how there was, I believe, the veto by the Prince
Emperor of Austria. Yeah.
Yes. And it was on account of that veto that Pope St. Pius X then in the next round was able to be elected. But you see just kind of providence, and you see the hand of God to prepare us for these times where we see the effects of modernism. And he definitely was a huge help and asset in preparing us for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sometimes when we talk about the church having taken such a wrong turn and basically becoming modernist in 1958, I think people believe that think that we believe that basically a switch was flipped in 1958. We went from just a pure church to being an anti-church, and it really wasn't that way at all. I think you can go all the way back to the French Revolution, which was when this infiltration started, and it was pretty well advanced by the time of Pope St. Pius X. Even I think that it was infecting the seminaries, and he knew it at the time, and so this infection was strong. It's just I think we had a run of good popes, and then with the Pope Pius XII and maybe Pope Pius XI with some diplomatic popes who were able to keep this infiltration, this modernism, this heresy from completely flowering publicly through the papacy, and they were able to hold that off. And then finally with Vatican II, it just I think it couldn't hold it back. It couldn't hold that dam back anymore, and it just burst. And but yeah, I agree that Pope St. Pius X did a lot in terms of helping to try to keep it all at bay.
And it's really pretty incredible if you continue on with that, and how he was elected because of a veto by the Austrian emperor, and very shortly after World War I was begun, and there are many conspiracy theories, quote unquote, I believe to be true, that World War I was in large part an attempt to overthrow the last few Catholic monarchies and the Holy Roman Emperor, which they did. And so you really got rid of pretty much all of monarchical Catholicism in Europe, practically. And there are many things about World War I, again, that could be talked about for hours. I mean, you had the massacre of the Catholic Armenians by the Turks. I mean, it's really an incredible time that these stories really get pushed under the rug, and you only hear about how bad the Germans and the Austrians were because, well, who lost, right? Who lost that battle? And again, also in this same exact time, Our Lady appeared at Fatima again. Our Lady coming to our aid and trying to help us after St. Pius X had I think St. Pius X was still alive, I think, but very briefly, I believe St. Pius X died in 1917. Or was he before?
He passed at the beginning of the war.
Did he? Okay, Father. Yeah, I'm sure you're right. Yeah, so, around the same time. So Our Lady. So St. Pius X did his best to try to stop it, and Our Lady appeared.
1914.
14. Okay, thank you, Father. And Our Lady appeared in 1917 and tried to do the same thing. Tried to say, hey, for goodness sake, this is coming. You have to change. The kings, the princes, the people. Everyone has to get better, or it's just going to get the errors from Russia are going to spread. You're going to have war, etc. And here we are, of course, almost over 100 years later, and all of Russia's errors, that being communism, modernism, etc., have spread. And of course, we've seen war, famine, death, and more importantly, the many, many deaths of souls, and followed up, of course, by World War II, which I don't think we need to go into much. And I think it's a good place to end part 2, because part 3 is going to go into what we just briefly mentioned with Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, and discuss from that time until our modern day a little bit about what's going on now and how we've slid so far since, again, the beginning in the Middle Ages. So that's the end of part 2. Please stay tuned for part 3, which will be coming up very shortly.